And when the Reverend Wright became a political pariah in 2008, as a result of those videotapes that were released showing him GDing America, chickens come home to roost, Jews this, whites that. And after Barack Obama had no alternative but to throw the Reverend Wright under the bus, Wright told me that he got an email from Barack Obama's best friend, Eric Whitaker. Now, Eric Whitaker is the vice president of the University of Chicago Medical Center. He's known Barack Obama since our Harvard days. He plays golf with him. He plays basketball with him. Their families go on vacation together. There's no two men who could be possibly closer together. And the Reverend Wright said that Eric Whitaker sent him an email offering him $150,000 if he would remain silent for the rest of the 2008 campaign. When the Reverend Wright refused this bribe, he then got a phone call from the man who had just thrown him under the bus, none other than Barack Obama, who said, "Hey, Rev," he called him Rev, "I'd like to meet you in a secure location." Secure location meaning he didn't want anybody to know about it. And the Reverend Wright said, "Why do you have to meet me in a secure location? You've been to my home hundreds of times. Come here." So Barack Obama got into a Secret Service SUV and went over to see the Reverend Wright. This is after he said he was going to have nothing to do with this guy. And during the hour he spent with him, he begged him to remain silent. And the Reverend Wright told him, again on tape, he told me this, "I can't do that. I've got to remain true to my principles." And Obama said, "You know what the trouble with you is, Rev? Your trouble is that you've got to tell the truth." And the Reverend Wright said, "Yeah, I mean, that's not a bad problem for a minister to have. Maybe you should have the same problem." Now, I've gone into this story about Obama and the Reverend Wright at some length because I think their relationship tells you a lot about the kind of man we have in the White House today. This is a man who sat at the knee of the Reverend Wright for 23 years, not just in the pew in the church listening to this hate, but in the Reverend Wright's home, one-on-one, hundreds of times. And he listened to the Reverend Wright spin his Marxist theories of black liberation theology, which is based on Marxism, because it's a theology that believes there's an oppressor class, whites, and an oppressed class, blacks, and that America needs to redistribute wealth and power. Now, is it any surprise that I concluded in my book that President Obama is actually, in my view, in revolt against the values of the society he was elected to lead, which is why he has refused to embrace American exceptionalism, the idea that we Americans are a special people with a special destiny, and why he has railed against the capitalist system, demonized the wealthy, and embraced the Occupy Wall Street movement. In addition to being the most divisive and radical left-wing president we have ever had in the White House, Obama is also, in my view, an amateur, and I'll tell you why. I believe that he is at bottom temperamentally unsuited to be the chief executive and commander-in-chief of the United States of America. I've got to take a drink after that one. temperamentally unsuited to be President of the United States. In my view, he is something new in American politics, the amateur, a president who is inept in the arts of management and government, who doesn't learn from his mistakes, and who therefore repeats policies that make our economy less robust and our nation less safe. That combination, a radical ideology and a bungling amateurism, that combination, my friends, I think is a toxic mix. I'm reminded of the difference between Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan, two presidents who entered the White House with very different visions of America and a very different way of getting the job done. You know, at the end of the day, Ronald Reagan would pick up the phone and call Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives. He'd say, "Hey, Tip, why don't you come on over and have a drink and we'll talk?" These two guys couldn't have been more different in their ideology and their points of view, their politics. But Tip went over. They opened up a bottle of whiskey. They had a drink. They told jokes. They reminisced. They had a good time. And then they finally got down to business. And Reagan would say something like this: "Tip, I have a bill I'd like to get passed, but can you get your boys together to get the votes?" And Tip would say, "Well, Mr. President, if you give us this and if you give us that, I think I can get you the votes." And Reagan would say, "Well, I think we can work this out." And they did work things out. They worked things out and they did the business of America. Can you imagine Barack Obama doing the same thing with John Boehner, the current Speaker of the House of Representatives? It's impossible. You can't. They've had one round of golf together, period. There's no relationship between the President of the United States and the equal branch of Congress, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. By his very nature, Obama is unable to reach out beyond his tight inner circle of Chicago operatives and reach common cause with the Republicans. I, for one, do not buy the mainstream media story that it's the Republicans who have blocked progress in Washington. In fact, my reporting proves just the opposite. Don't forget, I did 200 interviews, and many of them with Republicans. And I spoke to a top aide, a very top aide, of the Republican House leadership. And listen to this. Here's what he told me. Every modern president, he said, perhaps with the exception of Jerry Ford, entered the White House with a large quotient of self-assurance and maybe even arrogance. But what makes this president, Obama, different is that he is so beyond this. This insider that I spoke to then went on to say, not only is Obama self-assured and in his own eyes the smartest guy in the room, but in his estimation, all he has to do is state something, and the scales will fall from your eyes. Despite the storyline people create that he is a thoughtful, non-ideological compromiser, he has a distinct leftist ideology, socialist ideology, and can't make a decision that takes him out of his comfort zone. He went on to say he's got so little appreciation and knowledge of how Congress works that it's an equal branch of government. If you challenge him, he's furious. He gives you the death stare. He has no close relationship with any member of the Senate, Democrat or Republican, and certainly not in the House. John Boehner says, now this is a guy who works closely with John Boehner. John Boehner says that in his 20 years in Washington, he's been through 4 administrations, and that this one is completely opaque. He can't see it. He doesn't know who makes the decisions and how they make them in the Obama White House. You know, by all accounts, according to my reporting, Obama was elected to do a job for which, in fact, he has little relish. He doesn't find joy in being president. Like Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter, he's an introvert who prefers his own company to that of others. He's someone who finds extended contact with groups of people outside his immediate circle of operatives to be draining. He can rouse maybe a stadium of 80,000 people, but that audience is impersonal. Smaller gatherings can be harder for him. I interviewed a former State Department official, and he told me something I thought was very interesting. He said, while I was in the room, the president would get phone calls from heads of state. And more than once I heard him say on the phone to a head of state, I can't understand that I've got to meet with all these congressmen from Podunk City to get my bills passed. Podunk City, that's how he thought of congressmen. And when the meeting with him was over, the State Department official said. There was no lingering, there was no schmoozing, there was no clinging to personal relationships like Bill Clinton. You know, I heard the same complaint from people who raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for Obama during the last election. I interviewed a major American Jewish fundraiser in Chicago, a guy who's very high up in the American Jewish organizations. And while I had my notebook open, I was taking notes, he praised Obama to the skies. He could not do anything wrong. He loved him. I said, thank you. An hour and a half went by, closed my notebook, put it away, put my pen away. He said, let me take you to the elevator. On the way to the elevator, he stopped me, and I saw in his face a completely different expression. He said, you know something? He started a confession. My friends in the Jewish community call me, and they complain all the time about Obama. They never hear from him. They call the White House. They don't get a response. It's not like with Bill Clinton, who would call you and ask you about your grandkids and your kids in college and how your wife was and how your business was doing. I said, oh, that's very interesting. How about you? He's the guy who just told me how great Obama was. He said, I don't hear from him either. Obama doesn't reach out to anyone. He's above it. He's arrogant. He's haughty. He's the one in his own eyes.